Great. Well, thank you very much for being here, Jeff, and we'll see if any of your colleagues or friends join us as well. Good to have you on today. Happy to be presenting on the Havana Street Mobility Study, completed in part by the four panelists here today, including myself. And we're excited for the session today. And as Sheila said, if you have questions that come up during the course of our presentation, anything you want to know more about, please consider using the Q&A, and we'll take those up at the end. Jen, next slide, if you could, please. So we're going to very quickly start with some introductions so you know who's speaking today. And Hui Long, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Ted. Good afternoon. My name is Hui Liang Lu. I'm a principal transportation planner with the City of Aurora, and I was also the project manager for the project on the city side.
Great, thanks. And again, Ted Hyde, I'm a senior associate with Michael Baker International, and I was largely in charge of the bicycle and pedestrian planning and conceptual design elements of the study.
And hello, I'm Jennifer Carpenter. I am also a senior associate. I'm a transportation planner with Michael Baker International, and I was the project manager from the consulting team on this project.
And I am Carlie Campuzano. I'm the traffic manager at the City of Aurora, and I was on the technical advisory committee for this project.
Great, thank you, everybody. All right, just a quick snapshot of what we're going to cover today. Starting with an overview of the corridor, kind of setting that context and giving you a snapshot of some of the transportation and land use elements from the existing setting, and then talking about how a vision for the future of this corridor was forged through extensive collaboration and engagement, and then moving into the actual process that we employed as a project team to develop a set of recommendations that we'll get into some detail on. And then Carlie's going to talk about really progressing the study and the implementation piece of this and some of the exciting funding opportunities that have been pursued and successfully awarded, and what things are starting to look like on the ground in terms of the improvements. And then we'll wrap up with a lessons learned, highlighting some of the key takeaways for us as members of the project team. And then lastly, the Q&A, any questions you may have, anything you want to discuss further. We're excited for that piece of it as well. So add those questions, keep your thoughts in mind, and we'll go from there. Jen, next slide, please. Okay, overview of the corridor. Hui Long is going to provide kind of some base context here.
Thank you, Ted. So the study area is a 6-mile north-south multimodal transportation corridor on Havana Street, which is located just the western edge of the city next to Denver, and it is bounded by Thermos Avenue on the south and the Montview Boulevard on the north. The corridor connects residents and the businesses further north to I-70 and south to I-225 and I-25. Next slide, please. And in terms of the street topology, it varies from narrow 2-lane roadway section on the north side and to the very wide 8-lane section on the south side. Posted speed limit is 30 miles on the north, 30 miles per hour on the north, and 45 miles per hour on the south. And also on the north side, it has about just a little bit less than 10,000 ADT on the north and over 47,000 ADT on the south. So really the entire corridor varies widely from north to south. Next slide, please. And in terms of the land use and urban form, again, on the north, just essentially north of 6th Avenue, which is called Original Aurora, and it has mainly residential uses with typical traditional street grid. Then south of 6th Avenue, where we have pretty much a mixed-use commercial corridor with a very active business improvement district on Havana. And the land uses include auto-related uses such as dealerships, auto parts and repair shops, and also a number of large format big box retail such as Costco, Target, Lowe's, King Soopers, Safeways, And many of the blocks on the south side are large, which result in longer distance at signalized crossings for pedestrians and bicyclists. Next slide, please. And Havana Street Corridor is really a very important multimodal corridor. In addition to the vehicular travel, we have a very high transit ridership, about 6,000 daily riderships. And also a lot of people walking and biking along the corridor at some of the higher activity intersections, such as Colfax Avenue and Mississippi Avenue. We see somewhere around 250 to 300 bicycle pedestrian combined activities during the peak hour. However, the multimodal facilities are very inconsistent, especially such as sidewalks. We saw 3.5 or less sidewalk width on the north side. And also we saw a number of sidewalk obstructions or unpaved gravel sidewalk. As then on the south side, we have some nicely improved wider sidewalks. Next slide, please. And the corridor is very important from many aspects. Number one is the sales tax revenue. It's since 2015. The corridor is specifically from the Havana Improvement District's Business Improvement District. It contributes about over $20 million of sales tax, which represents somewhere between 9 to 10% of the entire city budget. And this corridor also provides very important regional connections. In addition to the automobile connections I mentioned earlier, it provides very important public transit connections on the north to the A-line rail service at the Central Park Station, and to the south to the H and the E line, the light rail station, at the Southmore Station. And this corridor is also included as one of the top recommended BRT candidate corridor by a recent BRT study. And this corridor also intersects with several major regional trails. On the south, it's the Cherry Creek Trail, and on the middle section, it connects with the Highline Canal Trails, really takes the bicyclists to all over the place in the region. And unfortunately, this corridor is also identified as a high injury network with a lot of crashes, and some of the portion of the corridor is also considered a critical corridor with a higher concentration of fatality and injury crashes. The data shows that between 2012 and 2019, there were about 7,500 total crashes for the entire corridor. And also this is a corridor, portion of it is a state highway south of 6th Avenue. It's about 4 miles long. And again, this corridor is boards to Denver. Next slide, please. And in terms of the demographics, this corridor within 1 mile of the study area has a lot of population, over 140,000, and many of them either do not have a car or cannot drive. Specifically, we have about a quarter of the population either older than 65 years old or their children. And half of them are minorities, and many of them have linguistic challenges. And this 51,000 average median income in 2019 represents 18% less than the Aurora City average. And 10% of the households doesn't even have a car. And this corridor also have significant anticipated job growth from 2020 to 2040. So it's a very vibrant corridor but with significant needs for multimodal enhancement. Okay, with that, I'll turn over to Ted to talk about the vision for the future.
Well, thank you. Great context. Appreciate that. Jen, if you could go on to the next slide here, please. All right. So for those folks listening in, as you can appreciate from planning studies you've done in the past, really before or as part of thinking about the future of whether it be a sub area, in this case, a corridor, you really need to see where you are, where you have been from both a policy and a regulatory standpoint. So as part of this study, we looked closely into several relevant guiding policy documents developed by the City of Aurora to kind of see where we were within that framework and really going back to 2004 up through the 2018 comprehensive plan, a very solid policy foundation, kind of envisioning Havana Street and corridors like it as true places where people can convene, where people can come to work, to play. And that very importantly for purposes of this study, where all modes, ages, and abilities could get around comfortably and safely, of course, including automobiles. So next slide, please. And then key stakeholders. As Huilong pointed out, a very interesting corridor in terms of who has an invested stake in the future of it. And if you look at these logos, you will see the very local neighborhood organizations up to the state level. A good part of this corridor is a CDOT facility, so they were an instrumental partner. Portion of it borders the city and county of Denver, so they were at the table. DRCOG essentially as the quote unquote investor, as this was a DRCOG grant that made this possible. And obviously RTD being a key partner given the ridership existing on the corridor and it being identified as a future BRT corridor. So from a stakeholder standpoint, a lot of interesting stuff going on. It contributed to some really, really good, interesting, oftentimes candid conversations about what was and was not possible. Next slide, please. All right, and then public engagement, kind of beyond that stakeholder piece. This was a very fun part of the project, both designing and then implementing kind of a multi-pronged engagement platform, because whether you were a business owner or a resident who casually used the corridor, we very much wanted to hear from you what you thought about the corridor as it stands today. How is it meeting your needs or not? And also, what did you see the future of the corridor being from a mobility and land use standpoint? So here are just some metrics identifying touch points and how successful they were in reaching a variety of different people among the public. We used everything from meetings to online surveys to Metro Quests, which was a great tool, really to hear from people in a variety of different ways. And the key part of this engagement was riding sidecar with us from the very beginning was the executive director of the Business Improvement District on Havana. And she was a terrific liaison and connector in terms of keeping the bid informed of the project progress throughout. Next slide, please. All right, so through those conversations with both stakeholders and input we received from the public, we were able to collaboratively, tough word, arrive at this vision for the future of Havana. And we feel really good about it. It combined that kind of those two key elements of land use and transportation, and really identifying this as a destination that would be accessible to all modes. I'm going to emphasize abilities there, where people can safely and comfortably get around to a variety of destinations, whether they be a student, a senior, an employee, a business owner, regardless. So I think as a team, we felt really good about this vision of setting the stage for the recommendations that were to come. Next slide, please. All right. So Jen is going to tell you a bit about the study process and kind of how we corralled this 6 to 7 mile entity. Go ahead, Jen.
Thanks, Ted.
Yeah.
All righty. So as Ted mentioned, we had a large task at hand, a 6 mile corridor that varied drastically from one end to the other. And so we had to figure out how we were going to break the corridor into realistic segments to be able to come up with customized recommendations for the varied sections of the corridor. So we started by looking at the city's comprehensive plan and their place types. And what we found is that the north end of the corridor is called Original Aurora, as Huiliang had mentioned. It's about a 2 mile segment and it's a city street. So it's typical of a city street with fewer number of lanes, typically 2, 3, lower speed, lower volume. We also noted that in this segment of the corridor, there is a whole lot of residential. It's primarily residential, which you can see in the gray areas on the map, but that there is some non-residential that occurs along Colfax Avenue, and that's where you'll see most of the colors show up in the map. The next segment is called City Corridor. It encompasses more than half of the study area and is a CDOT roadway that it is characteristic of most CDOT roadways that are higher volume, higher speed, and more number of lanes. So on this segment, there's a lot of auto-oriented businesses, things like car dealerships, gas stations, and auto parts stores. Those types of uses are typically counterintuitive to a walkable place. However, since these uses do contribute a lot to the overall tax revenue of the city, it was key that we found a happy medium as we were going through this process. Also notable is the connection to the 71-mile-long Highline Canal Trail that crosses Havana Street on this segment of the corridor. So the final mile of the corridor falls within the urban district. It continues to be a CDOT road at this location. This area of the corridor was envisioned as a high-density transit-oriented development. However, the current condition of this corridor is drastically different than the ultimate vision. You see a lot of separated uses, large employment centers, and small-scale retail centers. So the next thing that we did was we looked at existing conditions. From a pedestrian perspective, this corridor is very stressful. It has inconsistent sidewalk widths, a lack of separation from vehicle traffic, and infrequent crossings. As Huiliang had mentioned, the large blocks on the south end of the corridor create long distances between traffic signals where pedestrians can cross. That came up a lot during the study. And it's also very dangerous. So while there were only 2.7% of the total crashes that involved a pedestrian, 33% of those resulted in fatality. One other thing that we noted from the pedestrian perspective is that there were key connections to shared use paths along the corridor that we needed to make sure that people could access. So bicycling on the corridor is equally as or nearly as dangerous. Again, 2.7% of the total crashes involved a bicyclist, and 20% of those resulted in fatality. So it's important to note that there are no bicycle-specific facilities on this corridor and inconsistent sidewalks, both in width and in type. So in some cases they're paved, some cases they are not. And finally, there are, although there aren't dedicated bike facilities on the corridor, we did notice opportunities for connections to adjacent facilities that cross Havana Street. So this corridor is considered a high priority BRT route, and that is due to the high ridership on the corridor. However, we did notice that the bus stops in some cases didn't have the basic amenities, things like benches and shelters. And something that was somewhat notable that came out of this study was the fact that there were several locations where there wasn't a paved connection from the actual bus stop to the curb where the bus picks up. So when you have somebody in a wheelchair, they're traversing grass or gravel to get to the bus stop, or get to the bus, excuse me. We also noted that a number of the bus stops had poor lighting. Buses had to travel at slow speeds during peak hours because of the congestion on the corridor, and that resulted in long delays. During this project, though, the city did alert us to another project that they were working on. And that particular project was intended to improve many aspects of the transit route. So it would include things like bus bulb outs, queue jumps, and upgraded amenities at the stops. And we're excited to say for the city that that project is nearly complete. So this corridor has seen a lot of success and growth from a business and retail perspective. But what comes with success in many cases is increased traffic. So the corridor has a very high volume of traffic and limited right of way. When we were working on the study, the city asked us to try and limit right of way impacts on the corridor. And that resulted in us needing to come up with creative solutions to address vehicle demand and congestion. And so in the end, what we determined is that we needed to make sure that we considered multimodal improvements as a way to accommodate future demand. So taking all of this information from our existing conditions assessment, we created a set of mobility framework maps. And as you can see, there's a lot of information on here. So to make it more valuable and usable, we created 4 different maps. We started with the overview map that you can see here, and then we pulled out information that was specific to bicycles and pedestrians and put that on a map that gave us a pedestrian and bicycle focus. And we did the same thing for transit and the same thing for vehicles. And so we also included on these maps some of the existing conditions. So existing trails, existing bus routes, and major destinations, so that we could better see where there were gaps in the network and identify locations for potential need or improvement. And finally, we included some goals by mode so that we could use that information to reference as we identified strategies. So once we had all of that information and we kind of studied the maps, we created what we called strategy maps. And understanding that all modes are important on the Havana Street Corridor, we wanted to make sure that we came up with strategies that could address each of these modes. So on the left-hand side of this map, there is a list of strategies. Each line represents a different strategy, and they're color-coded by mode. And so we created this series of maps. They're shown in 2-mile segments so that we could zoom in and provide a little bit more detail on the map. And each of the improvements or strategies were identified either as like a location specific, and if they were location specific, we showed them where those would be on the map, or in some cases they were noted as corridor wide. And so this was really important because we wanted to make sure that as we were going through this process, that we provided equity across the entire corridor, which is very challenging to do on such a long corridor that's so varied. But that was one of our major goals. And so in the end, we came up with over 70 strategies. So to give you an overview of some of those strategies, we wanted to share these with you because we thought that these might be things that could be implementable in your cities or towns, your local agencies, or projects that you're working on if you're a consultant. So here you can see the 6 different categories that we broke the strategies up into by mode. And in parentheses, you can see how many strategies we identified for each mode. So for example, all modes had 5 strategies, 2 of which were to evaluate mobility hubs and to look at multimodal detection. For pedestrians, we noted the need for quality sidewalks with minimal obstructions and protected mid-block crossings where those crossing distances were really long. For bicycles, we identified the need for neighborhood bikeways and parallel routes, since bicycles are not allowed on Havana and wouldn't particularly want to ride on Havana. They can ride on the sidewalk, but if they want to ride in the street, we identified a few locations for parallel routes that they could in the future ride on, and noted those on the map. For transit, we spoke to all of the things that you would typically see at like a premium bus stop. So these are things like real-time bus info, lighting, trash cans, and those ADA compliant connections from the bus stop to the bus loading area. From a vehicle perspective, our focus was on improving safety by adding raised medians and trying to reduce vehicle conflict points. And then finally, from a land use perspective, we recommended adding gateways that would provide a sense of place as you enter the corridor. Okay, so once we finalized our list of strategies, we had to narrow them down so we could figure out which strategies we would move forward into conceptual design. And so to do that, we looked at these different considerations on this list here to prioritize and select those locations that would move forward. We also conducted a informal technical evaluation. So we included the technical advisory committee. We took all of the strategies to them, to city staff, and the Business Improvement District board to identify those locations or improvements that were feasible to implement and maintain and that weren't strongly opposed by the businesses and residents. In the end, these 8 strategies are what were identified as the top priorities for improving safety and mobility along the corridor. We presented these to stakeholders and we identified the pros and cons of each. So for example, raised medians would reduce conflict points for pedestrians, but they would also reduce access for businesses. Wider sidewalks would improve safety and comfort for bicycles and pedestrians, but they could also impede on what residents see as their property, even though we did have some additional right-of-way. So if you widen out away from the street, it could be taking space that they see as their own. And from these discussions, we determined that wider sidewalks and mid-block crossings were identified as the strategies that would bring the greatest benefit to the corridor, and that was followed by raised medians. So I'm going to turn it over at this point to Carlie, and she's going to talk to you about how we took all of this information and began to start implementing and moving this study forward.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. I'm Carlie, traffic engineer at the Public Works Department. So as we progress the study to the next phase, the project team really built on the visioning that Ted talked about and the various strategies that Jen talked about, and started to put pen to paper in more detail to really see what elements would be feasible and how they would have to be modified in the context of the corridor to really get them to fit in and all work together seamlessly. So to do this, the project team developed a concept plan to really start laying this out. And through this, a lot of the strategies that bubble to the surface through the various stakeholder meetings and public engagement meetings were really laid out on this map to see what would fit in and how exactly they would work with the geometric details and the general feasibility within the context of the roadway, just because this is an existing corridor with all sorts of constraints that you've seen through the previous slides. When we're talking about improvements, there's always going to be trade-offs. And so going through this exercise, I think really highlighted for us what those trade-offs were and how we would plan to address them moving this forward, which I think really helps because, identifying strategies is obviously the first step, but then we wanted to make sure that the strategies that we move forward with, we were really comfortable to say, these are things that we can do, and here's our plan for how best to do them, and here's what it would look like. So sometimes different strategies do conflict with each other just because they're competing for the same space in an area that's very limited and very tight. So going through this process, I think really helped us accommodate as many of the strategies and the modes as we could in the best way possible. And I think one important part of this process was really engaging the technical experts, those who were already part of our project management teams and technical working groups. But then the project team also reached out to others at the city and CDOT and RTD to really go over some of the specific design criteria to see, here's the strategy, here's how we think it would fit. Does this work in the overall context of the road, and does this meet design criteria for this type of project? So I thought going through that process was really helpful, just so we knew that we had strategies and a plan that would work. And I thought one of the interesting parts too is that a lot of the staff that we reached out to had very important historic knowledge on the corridor, and knowledge about other projects that were already planned in the works, so that we could blend together the strategies with what we knew was already in the pipeline, and it could all fit together a lot more seamlessly. Next slide, please, Jen. So once the concept plan was buttoned up, the next stage that we went through was to develop some detailed cost estimates. And so each strategy had an associated cost. I think it had a general time frame and then a proposed funding mechanism. And just from the engineering and implementation side, I think this was really helpful for me to have just as a final playbook of this is the plan for how we're going to get this done, so that this isn't just a plan on a shelf, and that we have a plan for implementation. So even an improvement that seems maybe relatively simple, like widening sidewalks, being able to identify some constraints, get a general cost, and then get a plan for the funding, I think is just really helpful to move things forward. So we identified some strategies that were maybe lower cost, so we could use internal staff to really get done right away and kind of capitalize on some of the momentum that we had with this study and with all the stakeholder support. And then we had some medium-term projects where maybe we could look and see that we could identify local funding for those types of projects. And then some higher dollar amount items, looking to see what future grants would be available, and maybe there's opportunities there. And even the next level of, well, what are those future grants, and what would fit within each grant, I think really helps us prepare for those grant applications and set ourselves up to be successful with those as well. If you could go to the next slide, Jen, please. So I think another really important thing that we did with this study, that I haven't seen done with a lot of other studies, is that we even took it a step further and started talking about maintenance. And I think maintenance is a really important thing that often doesn't get brought up in this level, but then can really impact a project later on if it's not thought about. So, even things, I go back to widening sidewalks just because I think that's something everyone can relate to, and that a lot of people are supportive of. If you just say, like, would you like wider sidewalks? A lot of times the answer is yes. But I think if you ask the question, would you want wider sidewalks? If it's a 10-foot sidewalk, if you property owner have to clear the snow, and if we're impacting your landscaping, that could be a different response. And I think knowing that in the beginning really kind of sets everyone's expectations to know what to expect with the project, and helps us get that important buy-in from all the different stakeholders later when we're moving towards implementation. Next slide, please. So all of those things that we did, I think, really set us up for support to get funding and to be successful with implementing the projects that were identified. So the corridor study was finished up relatively recently, and we've already pursued and were awarded millions of dollars in grant funding for some of the projects, which is really exciting. So one of the ones that we were awarded is the Revitalizing Main Streets grant. So we were awarded $1.6 million in funding to construct various bulb outs or curb extensions in the Northwest Aurora area. And these renderings that were done as part of the corridor study, and were kind of vetted through the public and business owners and all that, really helped us be successful with this grant and be competitive for this funding opportunity. So I think just thinking through some of those elements and being able to provide that traffic calming and pedestrian safety, I think will just be really amazing for this overall community in the original Aurora area. And design is underway now, and we expect to be in construction in the next couple of years. Next slide. Another grant that we were awarded very recently was a sidewalk improvement grant. So there were some DRCOG tip grants that we applied for. And I think this is one of the toughest sections on Havana that we identified, where you can see in the pictures, it's just a really important sidewalk connection. Lots of people, lots of demand to use this area, but all sorts of utility conflicts and, things that we know will make putting the sidewalk in more difficult, but things that we also were able to plan for, put a cost on, and that apply for this funding for. And so we were awarded over $6 million in funding and are going to start design on this soon as well, but the funding was for construction as well as design for this. So next slide. And with that, I will talk about lessons learned.
Great, thanks, Carlie. Appreciate that. A very long multi-month story condensed into 35 or so slides, but you know, when we were talking about this as a team, there definitely were some key takeaways and some lessons learned. So our hope is that with sharing a few of these, and these are not exclusive, but some we wanted to highlight that you know, you thinking about your communities and corridor plans you may currently be working on or have slated for the future, that some of these will be useful, if nothing else, that they'll be interesting. So Wei Long, I believe you have the first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the first lessons learned we thought that was very important and very helpful throughout the project is this close engagement of the business community and the facility and the business owners. Specifically, as I mentioned earlier, there's a very active BID along the corridor, and so we invited the executive director of the BID to serve on the project management team as one of the members of the PMT. And so this person comes to meetings pretty much every 3 weeks throughout the process, the project process. So that really helped us. So this person served really as a bridge and to communicate very effectively and timely with the business communities, all the property owners, the BID board members, about number one, to help the city, the project team to understand the needs and concerns. And number two, when we are in the process of developing strategies, those were also timely communicated back to the business communities. So that really helped. And that good working relationship actually extended beyond the project. And even through today, that we often, from time to time, receive emails or phone calls from the executive director about number of issues, concerns, or helps requested from the city staff. So it's a very good experience and lessons learned on that aspect.
Great, thanks. And you know, in the beginning of this exercise or undertaking, I think each of us on the project team in our own way kind of asked, like, 6 to 7 miles, such varying contexts. How are we going to do this? How do we plan for this? And how do we effectively talk about mobility in the future of such a long corridor? And you know, what we arrived at, as Jennifer highlighted, a manageable, approachable way to do this was really to divide that corridor up into kind of discrete segments that we could look at as kind of sub areas. It made the planning process feel much more manageable. And in the end, you know, as Jennifer said, we came up with some recommendations that were very location specific, but we were also able to arrive at a set that applied to the entire corridor. So I think in dividing it up into those discrete segments, it allowed us to identify some very specific, but also universal recommendations. So that was a useful approach. Number 3 was that, you know, on-street bike facility is not a given. I'll be honest, I went into this, you know, primarily as a bicycle pedestrian planner with kind of the thought that the recommendations were going to bear out, that we would somehow find a way to put protected bicycle facilities on Havana itself, between the curbs. But you know, what came to be through conversations with the stakeholders was that it really wasn't feasible given existing demand on the corridor versus capacity and what's projected for the future, including accommodation of BRT at some point in the future, that between the curbs, it really wasn't going to be feasible, certainly not ideal, to try to accommodate a separated on-street facilities. So we arrived at neighborhood bikeways on close parallel routes as a good alternative. So don't assume if you're doing a corridor planning exercise that on-street bike facilities is a given. Number 4.
Okay, so one of the other lessons learned that we identified was communicating early and often with those that are implementing and maintaining any of the recommended improvements that you might want to come up with. So our close coordination with the Public Works Department at the City of Aurora, with CDOT, with the Business Improvement District, and with the neighborhoods, neighborhood organizations allowed us to identify implementable solutions and come to a consensus on the details of those solutions. So we were able to identify the types of improvements and the location of where we thought they made the most sense, even though we had many stakeholders with varying priorities.
I think one of my main lessons learned through this was to not shy away from the challenging conversations involving right-of-way, specifically with property owners, both residential property owners and businesses. Right-of-way is a huge deal to them, and even as Jen said, even if the city has right-of-way, if it's an area that's really been functionally something that they view as their front yard or their front lawn for 30 plus years, I mean, that's a conversation that you need to have and be honest about and kind of explain. But having those conversations up front, I think, is a lot better than having the conversations later on when you're already out there with a shovel, and that's, I think, a lot more challenging. So having those up front is definitely a better way to go. Then I think the last takeaway, even though maintenance isn't the most exciting thing about a project, I think just being sure to factor that in and to get feedback from maintenance staff with the improvements and recommendations is really important, because we don't want to install something that's going to be really difficult for us to maintain. And if we do install something difficult to maintain, then we need to have a plan in place for how it's going to be maintained. That's all I have.
Great, thank you, Carlie. Jen, Huilong, thank you guys. Good job, team. And yeah, again, wanted to thank you guys who are participating by attending. Did not see any questions during the presentation come through. And just as I say that, I see one pop up. Let's see, from Jeff Butts, Boulder County. Hi, Jeff. Thank you for presenting this virtually really interesting and compelling project. Great to hear about the Bike Boulevard recommendation. Your question here, when looking at the mid-block crossings in the wider sections, do you anticipate including traffic signals? And if so, do you think they would be hawk, rectangular rapid flashing beacon, or traditional signal? So there's one. Second, shorter question, what aspects of transit design did your team include in the recommendations? So let's two-part this. The question about the mid-blocks and the type of signals that may be included. Jen, I'm going to put that to you with backup from Carlie.
Sure. So because of the nature of the corridor on the south end being as wide as it is with the high volumes, it made the most sense to include hawk signals at those locations. It's the safest. It's, you're not going to have blind spots. You physically stop the traffic to get the pedestrians across. On the north end of the corridor, there was one recommendation that I recall where we included an RRFB because it was a 2-lane road, and per all of the guidance that's out there, that was the recommended solution for that type of facility.
Great. Jen, thank you for that. Carlie, anything to add?
I think Jen hit the points really well. I think one thing I would add is that during the concept layout process, I think the consultant team was really deliberate with how those hawk locations would be fit in, because even in the section that's really wide, maybe 6 travel lanes plus other lanes, there's also a ton of curb cuts, and just fitting those in, I think, was really challenging. And I know that Jen went through a lot of iterations with me a little bit to try to say, where could we fit this in? And then is that where people are actually wanting to cross? And I think in some of those locations, we're planning to put in a median pedestrian refuge as well for those locations. So yeah, that's all I have.
And Carlie, I remember having to be also very deliberate about, the positioning of the hawks in relation to existing signals, given CDOT's requirements on the spacing. So that was another part of the puzzle. All right, so the second question was, what aspects of transit design did your team include in the recommendations? Jen, again, I'm going to give that one to you, and I may back you up on that.
So the transit piece of this was primarily focused on that element that I mentioned several times during the presentation of not having connections or ADA compliant connections from where people are waiting for the bus to where people actually get on the bus. And in addition to that, providing sidewalks. So we had several locations where we were trying to connect people from the bus stop to the landing zone and where they would, or loading zone, excuse me. But then we had other locations that we also needed to incorporate a sidewalk connection to get you to that bus stop because those were lacking. So those were the two primary focuses that I recall that we looked at from a transit perspective.
Yeah. And Jeff, just at a higher level, that's why it was so valuable to have RTD within the stakeholder group, was to be able to kind of not only advise on things like that, but to provide their, kind of protect their interests in a way, and just be sure that we weren't recommending anything directly contrary to kind of their standards or potential for future plans, et cetera. So
I'll add to that, Ted, that we also, when we were looking at those connections, we also, in one particular case that comes to mind, there was nothing but a post in the ground and the grass, and there wasn't a sidewalk connection, there wasn't anything. And so we used RTD standards to come up with a concrete area for the loading zone and a concrete area for a future bus stop or bus bench / shelter, so that could be accommodated as well, as the city came up with funds and maintenance ability to implement those.
Yeah. Okay, I don't see any other questions, but for any folks on the call, Jeff, thanks for yours. But other attendees, if you're coming up on a corridor study, we have about 10 minutes left here. If you have any kind of burning thoughts or questions, concerns about an upcoming effort that you may be working on, we welcome your questions. And if not, you can certainly reach out to us after and we could take it up that way. But let's see here. Yeah, I think that was it.
That's it. Well, if you do, like you said, if you have any other questions, you can reach out to them. You can reach them through the Whova app, or if you need their email, you can contact me and I can help put you in touch with them as well. This will be, or it is recorded. We will have it posted shortly, so you can go back and watch it to get more information. But other than that, I guess we can leave a few minutes early. It's the last day of the conference, so I won't complain about that. I'm going to be happy. So thank you guys, and everybody have a good rest.